Carol Beaumont.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to put on the record that, of course, Labor supports democracy and we support secret ballots, as we have said. And it is true that we supported Tau Henaray's bill to Select Committee so we could hear submissions and so we could ensure that we were confident that secret ballots do occur in industrial action. And, of course, that is what overwhelmingly was said to the Select Committee. This is in fact a nonsense bill. It is flawed and in fact in its first form was a complete joke. In its first form it merely required a ballot to be taken. It didn't have to have any particular result. That's how flawed it was. But it's also a cheap stunt. It is a cheap stunt and it's based on a flawed premise. It's based on a premise that union organisers, as the last speaker just said, force workers to take industrial action and have to see the whites of their eyes, and they have nothing personally to lose, but of course the poor old workers do. Well, it's based on a flawed premise because we actually operate in an age of voluntary unionism. We operate in an age where secret ballots are absolutely overwhelmingly the norm. And so there is no problem to solve. There was no evidence presented by officials of complaints that had been raised about workers feeling like they had been pressured into taking strike action. There was very little actual evidence presented by submitters that this was a problem. There were some assertions made by people like the Employers and Manufacturers Association, but there is actually no problem to solve. Just like the Paul Quinn bill, this is all about ideology, it's all about trying to be tough, and in the case of this particular bill, is based on Tau Henaray's experience in the 1980s, and he in fact cited in the media one of the reasons was his own personal experience of standing over workers to require them to take strike action. Well, of course, that was in a compulsory unionism environment, and that was because he was being a bully. And I have been a union organiser for many years, first of all under a compulsory unionism environment, and then primarily and mainly under a voluntary unionism environment. And I can tell you, like most of my colleagues, that I have never stood over workers, but even if I had tried to stand over workers, they have got their own minds. They can choose whether or not they are members of a union. And as Jackie Blue did get right in her speech, people do not take strike action lightly because it costs them money. It is hard to do because it costs them money. And in an involuntary unionism environment, and why would they? They can just leave the union if they want to. Workers take strike action when they are desperately trying to improve their appalling wages and conditions, or when their employer will not negotiate with them in good faith. And I think that, if people on the other side of the House had actually taken the time to genuinely engage with union members, there are probably the majority of union members in New Zealand have probably never taken strike action. And those that have would tell them that they took a secret ballot before they did, because that's the experience post the 1980s, certainly, when Tau Henaray's head is stuck in the 1980s, when he personally stood over workers and bullied them into taking strike action. And he said that himself in the media. So I think it's very interesting. I'm assuming, of course, and I'd love to be proven wrong, but I'm assuming the ACT Party will support this bill. Now, of course, they're the party of freedom. They're the party supposedly of freedom. So I'll be very interested to hear whether they get up and speak on this bill, because actually, why don't unions as organisations have the freedom to determine their own rules and to have clearly in there, as most of them do, if not all of them, provisions for secret ballots? Why does the government have to intervene to put this in to solve a problem that doesn't exist? And the reason is because it's about freedom for everybody except unions, because what is underlying this is a real hatred in some cases, and certainly antipathy across the other side of the House about unions. They don't like unions. And why is that? And the reason is quite clear. Because unions are about organising workers so they can get a fairer deal, so they can get a fair share of the pie. But a modern union, and I would just love to really try and open the eyes of members across the House as to what a modern union looks like. Because I really genuinely believe that most members over there are stuck in a time warp that they don't actually know. And if somebody like Michael Woodhouse was honest, he would tell you that in dealing with organisations like the Nurses Organisation, that he has dealt with people who are very professional about their job, who care intensely about the sector that they work in, who actually resolve more disputes than they create, that actually ensure that their members' voice is heard, that they want to see their members get fair access to training and upskilling, that actually they have a view on how people in the health sector should be treated. And Michael probably could tell you that because he's dealt with modern unions in recent times. But unfortunately, I think most people across the House are stuck in a time warp based on the sort of bully boy tactics that Toh Henare exhibited in the Northern Clerical Union in the 1980s. It is not the reality of a modern trade union. And that's the shame, that over the other side of the House, people are not taking the time to actually find out what is the reality. Because, unfortunately, this government, if they tried to find out the reality, would see that for us to change our workplaces, to create workplaces that were really productive, to create the sort of economic growth that we want, we actually have to have workers engaged, skilled, involved, and with independent voice. So I put that challenge across there. This is the sort of bill that's based on, as I said, a failed and a flawed premise. I've talked to you about my experience. I've never, in all my years as a union official, stood over anybody. I have led strikes. I have been involved in organising workers where they have taken strike action. But I can tell you that that was done democratically, it was done by secret ballot, and it was done as a last resort. And it was done because workers absolutely have the right to organise, to collectively bargain, and in the absence of getting any progress through collective bargaining, to take strike action to put forward their case. I have to say, you cannot force people to take strike action. I mean, it's a nonsense to think about how you can force people to take strike action. Are you going to stand over them and physically push them out the door? Are you going to barricade the doors so they can't get back in? Are you going to require them to stay out when they don't want to? Can you ever imagine as a union organiser that you will ever be able to organise that workplace again in that circumstance? Of course you cannot. And I just want to say that my colleague Darian Fenton touched on this. The problem with this bill is that it's unbalanced as well. It focuses solely on industrial disputation from the point of view of unions. It focuses on strikes. It has no interest in dealing with the other side. The Employment Relations Act also aligns strikes and lockouts. Now, where is there any similar limitations on employers taking industrial action? There is none. And a number of submitters made that point. And I have to say to you, in a very big lockout of recent times, and lockouts are rarer than strikes, that's true, but they tend to be longer and more costly. The progressive lockout, the progressive distribution centre lockout cost those workers and their families thousands and thousands of dollars. Those people were locked out. Who made that decision? Well, it wasn't the board of Progressive, probably. It certainly wasn't the shareholders. And when the value of the share of Progressive Enterprises, which is Foodtown and Countdown, when that value of those shares went down, did those shareholders have any right? Had they had any say in that lockout? No, they had not. So if this government was serious about this issue, they would also be looking at that side of the equation. So I just want to say that we will see increasing disputation in this country, and I predict that, and I'm sure that it will be right, because this is a government that is anti-union, anti-worker, and it is a government that is sitting there and watching the gap between rich and poor grow. It is doing nothing to address the gap in wages between Australia and New Zealand, and hammering unions is the wrong way to go about closing that gap. if the parties across the other side were serious about